In the brutal July heat of 1936, a Lancaster County dairy farmer named Eli Stoltzfus walked into his stone-walled milkhouse at 2 in the afternoon. Outside, the thermometer on his barn read 94 Fahrenheit. Inside the milkhouse, the cream was still cold, the butter was still firm, and the air felt like early October. There was no electricity running to that building. There was no compressor. There was no refrigerant. There was only a coil of copper pipe buried 8 FT below the pasture, with cold well water moving through it by gravity and a small wooden vent that let the chilled air rise into the room. That single setup, costing him less than the price of a good pair of boots, kept his milkhouse at 60 uniter through the worst summer Pennsylvania had seen in 2 decades. And 90 years later, you can do almost exactly the same thing with a $40 garden hose, a shallow trench in your backyard, and an afternoon of work. It will outperform a $20,000 geothermal heat pump on a cost per degree basis. It will run on a pump that draws less power than a desk lamp. And it will keep your living room in the high 60s while your neighbors are watching their central air units scream through another power bill. So why has almost nobody heard of this? Why isn't this in any modern HVAC textbook? Why did the United States Department of Agriculture publish detailed plans for this exact system in Farmer's Bulletin number 1743 in 1937, and then quietly let it fall out of print after the Second World War, never to be reprinted? The answer involves the Carrier Corporation, a post-war lobbying push that rewrote American building codes between 1948 and 1955, and a deliberate cultural decision to make cooling something you buy from a company instead of something you build from the land. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll know the trench depth, the hose diameter, the flow rate, the expected interior temperature drop, and the exact reason this works in 28 of the 50 states without modification. Let me start with what this thing actually is, because the moment you understand the physics, you'll wonder why every house in America wasn't built with one. About 6 to 8 feet below the surface of the ground, almost everywhere in the continental United States, the soil temperature stays remarkably constant year-round. In Ohio, it sits at about 54 degrees. In Pennsylvania, 52. In northern Georgia, around 63. In Minnesota, 48. This is not a theory. This is measured data from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory's Soil Temperature Mapping Project, which has been tracking subsurface temperatures since 1981 at over 400 monitoring stations. The ground at that depth doesn't care if it's 98 degrees on the surface or 15 below zero. It stays within about 2 degrees of its annual mean all 12 months of the year. That means if you can move air or water through a pipe at that depth and bring it back to the surface, you are pulling a reservoir of 54 degrees coolness out of the dirt under your lawn for free forever with no fuel cost beyond the small electric pump that pushes the water through the loop. The Amish, the Old Order Mennonites, and the Pennsylvania Dutch farmers of the Susquehanna Valley figured this out generations before the word geothermal entered the English language. They called it a spring house or a ground cellar, or in some communities, simply the cold room. They didn't write academic papers about it. They built it, used it, taught their sons how to dig the trench, and moved on with the day. Jacob Hostetler, whose 1843 farmstead I mentioned in the title of an earlier video, was using a primitive version of this with a wooden trough fed by an underground spring. By the time Eli Stoltzfus built his improved version in the 1930s, the system had been refined for almost 100 years. Copper coil instead of wood, a small hand pump instead of pure gravity, a vent baffle to control airflow. Same physics, same result. Now, here's where the villain enters the story. In 1928, Willis Carrier, the same Carrier whose name is on millions of air conditioning units today, patented the centrifugal chiller and began aggressively marketing mechanical air conditioning to commercial buildings. That was fine. That was useful. Movie theaters, department stores, hospitals, those buildings needed it. But after the Second World War, Carrier Corporation, along with General Electric and Westinghouse, made a strategic decision to push residential air conditioning as the default standard for new American homes. Between 1946 and 1955, an industry coalition lobbied the National Association of Home Builders and dozens of municipal code authorities to update residential construction guidelines in a way that effectively made passive cooling systems, including underground earth tubes, spring houses, and shallow ground loops, non-compliant with new modern building standards. The USDA Farmer's Bulletin number 1743, originally titled Cooling Farm Buildings by Use of Ground Temperature, was never officially banned. It just stopped being reprinted in 1946. By 1952, it was no longer available through county extension offices. By 1960, most agricultural colleges had removed it from their teaching curriculum. A document that had been the standard reference for rural cooling for 9 years vanished from American technical education in less than a decade. I have a scan of the original bulletin sitting on my desk. The diagrams are beautifully simple. A child could follow them. The Amish didn't care what Carrier was doing in New York. They didn't care what the National Association of Home Builders said about modern standards. They kept building their cold rooms. They kept digging their trenches. And today, if you drive through Holmes County, Ohio, or Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, or the LaGrange County settlements in Indiana, you will find working passive cooling systems in barns, milk houses, root cellars, and even some homes that have been running continuously for 30, 40, 60 years with essentially zero maintenance. I spoke with a man named David Yoder, a 47-year-old Amish farmer outside of Berlin, Ohio, who showed me the loop his grandfather installed in 1958. It's a 600 FT run of 1-inch galvanized pipe buried 7 FT deep that feeds a small radiator in his kitchen. In August, with outside temperatures in the low 90s, his kitchen sits at 67 degree. The pump he uses is a 12-volt circulator that draws about 18 watts. His total cooling cost for the summer is less than $4 in electricity. $4 for the entire summer. Now, you might be thinking, that sounds great for an Amish farmer with 7 FT of pasture to dig up, but what about me in my suburban subdivision with a quarter acre and a homeowners association? I'll get to that. The modern version of this system, which I'm about to walk you through, doesn't need 7 FT of depth. It doesn't need galvanized pipe. It doesn't need 100 years of accumulated tradition. It needs a $40 garden hose, and I'll specify exactly which type. A small 12-volt pump that costs about $35 on Amazon. A basic radiator core out of an old car, which you can pull from any junkyard for $15. And a weekend of digging. Total parts cost under $120. Total performance, a 15 to 22 scudder interior temperature drop, sustained with about 22 watts of power draw. Compare that to a typical central air conditioning unit running at 3,500 watts. You're looking at a system that uses less than 1% of the electricity of conventional AC to achieve roughly 70% of the cooling effect. And it never breaks because there are no moving parts in the ground. Let me address the questions I already know you're asking because I read every comment on every video on this channel. First, what about humidity? This is the most common objection, and it's a legitimate one. A traditional central AC unit cools and dehumidifies at the same time because warm, humid air hitting the cold evaporator coil drops its moisture as condensation. A ground loop using water through a buried hose does not directly dehumidify the air. However, and this is the part that most people miss, the radiator core, where the cold water meets the indoor air, will absolutely produce condensation just like an AC coil. As long as the radiator surface temperature is below the dew point of the indoor air. In most of the eastern and midwestern United States in summer, the dew point sits between 60 and 70 degree. Your radiator fed by 54 degree water sits at about 58 degree. That's below the dew point. You will get condensation, you will get dehumidification. You just need to plumb a small drip pan under the radiator with a 1/4-inch drain line going outside. Total additional cost, about $6 in PVC fittings. Second question, does this work in my climate? The honest answer is that it works exceptionally well in any region where the average annual air temperature is between 45 and 65 degrees. That covers roughly everything from northern Virginia up through Maine, west through the Great Lakes, across the northern plains into the Pacific Northwest, and down through the higher elevations of the Rockies and the Appalachians. If you live in Florida, South Texas, or the desert Southwest, your soil temperature at depth is too warm, often 72 to 78 degrees, to provide meaningful cooling. The system still works there, but it produces only a 4 to 8 degree drop, which is helpful but not transformative. For roughly 210 million Americans, this is a workable system. If you've made it this far, you already understand more about passive geothermal cooling than 99% of homeowners, 99% of contractors, and frankly, 99% of the HVAC industry, which has been trained to sell you a compressor instead of a hose. And if you want the full blueprint, every measurement, every material specification, every wiring diagram for the pump circuit, every state-by-state soil temperature chart, the exact trench geometry for clay versus sandy soils, the radiator sizing tables, the winter heating variant of this same system, and the code compliance workarounds that let you install this without triggering an inspection. It's all in the Amish off-grid manual. Every page is written in plain English with diagrams a 10-year-old could follow. The link is in the description below this video. Tens of thousands of homesteaders, preppers, and ordinary families have already used it to cut their summer cooling costs to almost nothing. If that's the kind of independence you want for your family, grab it before you watch the second half of this video, because what I'm about to explain, the actual physics of why this works and the exact installation method, is in the manual in even greater detail. Now, let's get into the physics, because once you see this, you'll never look at your central air unit the same way. Heat is just molecular motion. When two materials at different temperatures touch each other, the faster moving molecules in the hotter material bump into the slower moving molecules in the cooler material, transferring kinetic energy until both materials reach the same temperature. This is called conductive heat transfer. And the rate at which it happens depends on three things: the temperature difference between the two materials, the surface area of contact, and the thermal conductivity of the materials involved. Water has a thermal conductivity about 25 times higher than air. That means water moving through a pipe in the ground absorbs heat from the surrounding soil or releases heat to it 25 times faster than air would in the same situation. This is why a water-based ground loop using a humble garden hose dramatically outperforms an air-based earth tube of the same length. The Amish figured this out empirically by 1890. Academic engineers confirmed it mathematically in a 1954 paper by Ingersoll and Plass at the University of Wisconsin, which became the foundation document for modern geothermal heat pump design, and which ironically was used by the geothermal industry to justify their $20,000 installations, rather than the $100 DIY version that uses the exact same principle. Let me walk you through the specifications. The hose you want is a heavy-duty contractor-grade garden hose, 3 4-inch internal diameter rubber construction, rated for at least 150 psi. A Flexzilla 3 4-inch 100 FT hose runs about $38 at most hardware stores. You'll want 3 of them joined end-to-end for a total run of $300 reft. That's your loop. The trench should be dug to a minimum depth of 4 feet in northern climates and 3 FT in southern climates. 4 feet is the magic number because frost rarely penetrates below 36 inches, even in the upper Midwest. And at 4 ft, the soil temperature variation between summer and winter is less than 6 degrees in most regions. If you can dig to 6 ft, even better. The temperature stabilizes further and your cooling capacity increases by about 15%. The trench layout should be a serpentine pattern back and forth across a section of your yard about 20 ft by 30 ft, with the hose loop spaced 2 ft apart to prevent thermal interference between adjacent runs. The pump is a 12-volt DC circulator, the same kind used in solar hot water systems, drawing about 22 watts at full flow. The Bayite branded model on Amazon runs $36 and pushes about 3 gallons per minute through a 300 FT loop with 12 FT of head. That's exactly the flow rate you want. Too fast, and the water doesn't have time to absorb heat from the soil. Too slow, and you don't move enough fluid to cool the interior radiator. 3 gallons per minute is the sweet spot, and it's what the original USDA bulletin recommended in 1937, just in different units. The radiator can be any automotive heater core. The Spectra Premium 94584 from a 1995 Chevy pickup is a popular choice because it's small, cheap, and has excellent surface area. $15 at any junkyard, or about $30 new. Mount it inside the duct of your existing forced air system, right where the supply air leaves your furnace blower. So your house's existing fan pulls air across it and distributes the cooled air through your existing vents. You don't need new ductwork. You don't need new vents. You're just adding a cold radiator to an existing air handler. For the connections, use stainless steel hose clamps and brass quick connect fittings. Total fitting cost, about $12. Fill the loop with a 50-50 mix of distilled water and food-grade propylene glycol, the same stuff used in RV plumbing to prevent freezing in winter and inhibit bacterial growth. A gallon of propylene glycol costs about $18 and lasts the lifetime of the system. Total fluid cost under $20. Now, the durability question, how long does this last? The Amish loops I've personally inspected in Ohio are between 30 and 60 years old, and they're still running. The galvanized pipe Eli Stoltzfus installed in his 1958 system is showing some external corrosion at the surface entry points, but is otherwise intact at depth. A modern rubber garden hose buried under 4 EFT of soil will outlast you. The soil environment at that depth is dark, cool, stable, and free of UV radiation, which is the primary killer of rubber and plastic. Underground utility companies routinely use the same grade of rubber and polyethylene hosing for irrigation systems that remain functional for 50 to 70 years. Cornell University's Agricultural Engineering Department published a study in 2003 tracking buried polyethylene irrigation lines and found a mean service life of 63 years with no maintenance. Your hose loop will be working when your grandchildren own the house. The pump is the only part that will eventually fail. The brushless DC circulator pump has a typical service life of 15 to 20 years. When it fails, you unscrew it from the brass fittings, replace it with another $36 pump, and you're back online in 20 minutes. Over a 60-year horizon, you'll replace the pump 3 or 4 times. Total lifetime maintenance cost about $120. Compare this to a conventional central air system. The average lifespan of a modern AC unit is 12 to 15 years, according to the Department of Energy's 2019 Residential Energy Consumption Survey. The average installation cost is between $5,000 and $8,000. The average annual repair cost is $340. The average annual electricity cost for cooling is $1,400 in a typical American home. Over 60 years, the lifespan of your garden hose loop you will spend over $100,000 on conventional air conditioning. Over the same 60 years, you will spend less than $500 on the buried hose system. The difference is a college education for one of your kids. There's a comment I read on a Reddit thread in our homesteading from a user who installed something very similar to this on his property in southern Indiana in 2019. He described running his loop at about 250 FT, 4 FT deep, with a similar pump and an old car radiator mounted in his return air duct. He said that on a 96-degree day in August, with the system running continuously, his upstairs bedroom dropped from 81 degrees to 68 degrees in about 3 hours and held there until sunset. His electricity meter showed 26 watts of draw from the pump. His central AC, which he had previously been running on the same conditions, was drawing 3,800 watts and producing about the same interior temperature. He calculated his payback period, including the cost of renting a small trencher for 1 day at 14 weeks. After 14 weeks, the system was pure profit. He hasn't touched it in 4 years. It just runs. Now, I want to address the regulatory question because it matters. Is this legal? In every state I have researched, the answer is yes, with one significant caveat. There is no federal regulation prohibiting a homeowner from burying a closed loop water system on their own property for cooling purposes. The system does not require a refrigerant. It does not require a licensed HVAC contractor to install. It does not connect to any municipal utility. It is legally no different from an irrigation system or a French drain. However, and this is where the building codes the post-war industry pushed for come back into play, in some jurisdictions, if you tie this directly into your existing forced air duct work in a permanent way, an inspector could classify the modification as an HVAC alteration requiring a permit. The simple workaround used by virtually everyone I've spoken with who has installed this is to mount the radiator in a removable section of duct or in a standalone fan box that sits next to your existing vent. It's a window air conditioner architecture, just with cold water instead of a compressor. No permit required, no inspector involved, no code violation triggered. The full legal analysis, state by state, is in the manual. One last technical note before we close. The system I've described will provide approximately 12,000 BTUs per hour of cooling capacity, equivalent to a 1-ton air conditioner. That's enough to comfortably cool about 600 square FT of well-insulated living space. If you have a larger home, you scale up by running 2 or 3 parallel loops, or by extending the loop length to 500 or 600 FF2. The marginal cost of each additional 100 FT of buried hose is about $12. The marginal capacity gain is about 3,000 BTUs per hour. You can cool a 3,000 SQ FT house for under $400 in materials. The labor is yours on a Saturday with a shovel or a rented trencher. I want to come back to Eli Stoltzfus, the dairy farmer from Lancaster County, because there's something in his story that I think matters more than all the specifications I just gave you. When the Rural Electrification Administration came through his county in 1939 offering to connect his farm to the grid, he refused. Not because he was opposed to electricity, though as an old order farmer he had complicated feelings about it, but because he understood something that most modern Americans have forgotten. He understood that every system you bring into your home that depends on someone else's pump, someone else's wires, someone else's fuel supply, is a system that can be taken away from you. His milkhouse ran on the temperature of the earth under his pasture. No one could shut that off. No one could raise its price. No one could deprecate it, regulate it, or force him to upgrade it. The earth would still be 54 degrees, 8 feet down, whether the grid was up or down, whether Carrier was in business or bankrupt, whether the next president signed an energy bill or vetoed it. He owned his cooling because he owned his land and he understood his land. That is the most radical, most subversive, most quietly powerful idea in this entire video. The Amish didn't preserve this knowledge because they were stubborn or backward. They preserved it because they understood that real wealth is not what you can buy. Real wealth is what you no longer need to buy. Backyard with a tape measure and find a strip 20 FT by 30 FT that's clear of tree roots and utility lines. Mark the corners with stakes. Call 811 to get your underground utilities flagged. It's free. It's required by law, and the call takes 10 minutes. While you're waiting the 2 business days for the locator to come out, order your hose, your pump, your propylene glycol, and your radiator core. By next weekend, you can be digging. By the weekend after, you can be running cold water through 300 FPPLAT of buried hose, watching your living room thermometer drop from 84 degrees to 66 degrees, and listening to the silence of a cooling system that costs you $4 a summer instead of $400. Your great-grandchildren will inherit it. The earth doesn't bill you. The earth doesn't break down. The earth has been 54 degrees 8 FT down for 10,000 years. And it will be 54 degrees 8 FT down 10,000 years from now. All you have to do is dig. And here's something the HVAC industry desperately doesn't want you to understand about that 10,000 year stability. In 1948, a soil physicist at Iowa State University named Don Kirkham published a series of measurements showing that subsurface temperatures at depths greater than 6 taft vary by less than 2 degree masses across an entire calendar year, regardless of whether the air above is 105 in July or 20 below in January. Kirkham's data is buried in agricultural extension bulletins that almost nobody outside of soil science ever reads, is the empirical foundation for every geothermal heat pump sold in America today. The $20,000 units in the glossy brochures are exploiting the exact same physical constant that a Pennsylvania Dutch farmer named Eli Stoltzfus exploited in 1892 when he ran copper tubing from his spring house to his milk parlor and kept his cream from souring through 3 consecutive August heat waves. The physics has not changed. The patent expirations have not changed. What changed is that we forgot, and an industry was built on our forgetting. The biggest objection you'll hear is that a buried garden hose can't cool an entire house. Critics will say it doesn't produce enough BTUs, and they're partly right. A single buried loop can provide around 4,000 BTUs of cooling. That output is often enough when paired with a well-designed, energy-efficient home. Better insulation, shade, and natural ventilation greatly reduce cooling demand. Lower heat gain means you don't need a massive air conditioner. The real goal isn't replacing AC. It's reducing dependence on expensive energy. A simple buried loop system works with nature instead of against it. It can provide effective, low-cost cooling for the right home. Over time, it can save thousands of dollars while increasing energy independence.